I was standing in the rain when everything ended. My phone shook in my hand, screen glowing with Ethan's name, and I whispered, "Please answer me." The call rang. It rang again. I said, "Ethan, talk to me. Just tell me what I did wrong." Rain slid down my face, mixing with tears I refused to wipe away. I said, "We planned this life together. You promised." Silence answered me. I laughed softly and said, "You're busy, right? I can wait." Minutes passed. Cars splashed water near my shoes. My chest hurt, but I kept calling. "Ethan," I begged. "I'm outside. I'll stand here all night." He never came. Earlier that day, Clara smiled at me across the cafe table. She stirred her coffee and said, "You look tired." I smiled back and said, "Love does that." Ethan didn't look at me. He checked his watch and said, "I have a meeting." I asked, "Can I come with you?" He replied, "It's not your world." Clara's eyes flicked up. She said, "You should rest, Iris." I nodded, pretending not to feel small. In the rain, my phone buzzed once. A message appeared. "Stop calling." That was all. I whispered, "Is that it?" My hands shook as I typed. Did I do something wrong? No reply. I remembered how I paid his debts, cooked his meals, waded through his moods. I said out loud, "I loved you more than myself." The rain grew heavier. My legs felt weak. I slid down against a wall and said, "I would have forgiven anything." A figure approached. It was Clara, holding an umbrella. She stopped a few steps away and said, "You shouldn't embarrass yourself." I looked up and asked, "Is he with you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He chose what's better for his future," she said gently. I laughed and asked, "And I was what?" She didn't answer. She just said, "Go home." I pressed my palm to my chest and whispered, "Ethan, listen to me." My phone stayed dark. I felt something tear inside me. I thought, this is what dying feels like. Loving someone until nothing is left. My vision blurred. I whispered, "I'm sorry for loving you." The rain faded. The noise faded. Everything went black. I heard my heartbeat pounding and said, "Don't leave me like this." My phone slipped from my fingers. I tried to stand and said, "I can change. I'll be quieter." The rain soaked my clothes. I remembered Ethan saying, "You're too much," and me answering, "I'll learn." I laughed weakly and said, "See? I learned." A stranger passed and asked, "Are you okay?" I shook my head and said, "I just lost everything." He hesitated, then walked away. I whispered, "Even strangers know when to leave." My chest tightened. I pressed my forehead to the wall and said, "I gave you my youth." I remembered nights waiting by the door saying, "He'll come home soon." I remembered mornings making coffee and saying, "Today will be better." I whispered, "I was wrong." The rain felt cold. My breathing slowed. I thought, if love is this painful, maybe I was never meant to survive it. I closed my eyes and said, "This is my end." I waited for warmth, for light, for him. Nothing came. I whispered, "Goodbye." My body felt heavy, my thoughts quiet. The rain kept falling, steady and uncaring, as if the world never noticed my heartbreak at all. I hoped the darkness would erase the pain and carry my love somewhere it could finally rest without me begging any more in the rain tonight. I woke up gasping, my hands clutching the bedsheet, and said, "Where am I?" The ceiling above me was familiar, cracked near the corner, and my heart slammed as I whispered, "This is my room." I sat up and laughed softly. "I'm dreaming," I told myself. I reached for my phone and checked the date. I froze. "No," I said, "this can't be real." Memories crashed into me.
Rain.
The wall. Ethan's silence. I pressed my palms to my eyes and said, "Calm down, Iris." My door opened and my mother asked, "Are you awake already?" I stared at her and said, "Mom?" My voice shook. She frowned and replied, "Why are you staring like that?" I swallowed and said, "I just had a bad dream." She sighed and said, "Get ready for breakfast." When she left, I whispered, "She's alive." My chest felt tight, but I didn't cry. I stood in front of the mirror and said, "You look the same." My reflection stared back, younger, softer, still foolish. I remembered kneeling in front of Ethan, saying, "Please don't leave me." I remembered apologizing for things I never did. I said to the mirror, "Never again." My hands stopped shaking. My phone buzzed. Ethan's name appeared. I stared at it and said, "So this is the past." I answered and said, "Hello." He laughed and replied, "Why do you sound strange?" I said, "I just woke up." He said, "Come see me later." In my past life, I would have rushed. Now I said, "I'll see." There was a pause. He asked, "Are you upset?" I answered, "No." After the call, I sat on the bed and whispered, "I loved you like oxygen." I remembered paying his bills and saying, "It's okay, I trust you." I remembered him saying, "You're too sensitive." I hugged my knees and said, "I was weak." The realization hurt, but it didn't break me. Maya knocked and said, "You're awake early." I opened the door and said, "Do I look different?" She laughed. "You look tired," she said. I nodded and replied, "I won't be anymore." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious," she teased. I smiled and said, "I am." When I was alone again, I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I whispered, "I died once." My heart felt strangely calm. I said, "This time, I choose myself." The fear faded, replaced by something cold and steady. I closed my eyes and promised, I will never chase him again. I sat up again and laughed quietly. "So this is a second chance," I said. My phone buzzed once more. A message from Ethan read, "Don't forget tonight." I typed, "I won't," then deleted it. "I don't owe you anything," I whispered. I remembered saying, "I'm sorry," every time he frowned. I said, "I was trained to shrink." I stood and said aloud, "Not anymore." My reflection didn't argue. I heard my mother call, "Breakfast is ready." I answered, "I'm coming." My voice sounded steady. At the table, she said, "You seem quiet." I replied, "I'm thinking." She smiled and said, "About him?" I shook my head and said, "About me." She paused, confused, and changed the subject. I ate slowly and thought, I survived once. I can survive again. Back in my room, I opened the window and said, "I won't beg." The air felt new. I sat on the bed and decided, if he walks away, I'll let him. My fear settled into resolve. I whispered, "This is how I begin." Today, I choose silence, distance, and control over love. Ethan called my name like nothing had changed. "Iris," he said, smiling, stepping into my space. I looked at him and waited. He frowned slightly and asked, "Why are you staring like that?" I answered, "I'm listening." My voice sounded calm, almost distant. He laughed and said, "You're acting strange." I shrugged and replied, "Am I?" Inside, my heart jumped, remembering rain, walls, and silence, but my face stayed still. He leaned closer and said, "Did I upset you yesterday?" In my past life, I would have rushed to reassure him. Now I said, "I don't know." His smile faded. "You always know," he replied. I met his eyes and said, "People change." He studied me and asked, "Did someone say something to you?" I shook my head. "No one had to," I said quietly. We sat down and he talked about his plans, his stress, his future. I nodded when needed and said, "That sounds busy." He paused and said, "You're not paying attention." I answered, "I heard you." He tapped the table and said, "You used to ask more questions." I said, "I'm trying to listen instead of fixing things." The words surprised even me. He sighed and said, "You're mad." I replied, "I'm not." He laughed sharply. "You're always emotional," he said. I felt the old pain twist inside me. but I breathed out and said, maybe I learned control. His eyes narrowed. Since when? He asked. I smiled faintly. Since I realized feelings don't keep people. There was a long pause. He reached for my hand and said, you don't feel warm. I gently pulled back and said, I'm fine. My chest hurt, remembering how I once clung to that hand like a lifeline. I told myself, don't react. He asked, are you seeing someone? I shook my head and replied, no. He looked relieved, then confused, and said, then what's wrong with you? I stood up and said, nothing is wrong. He followed me and said, you're avoiding me. I answered, I'm giving you space. He scoffed. I never asked for that, he said. I looked at him and replied, I needed it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Later, my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan read, did I do something? I stared at the screen and whispered, you did everything. I typed, I'm busy, and put the phone down. My hand shook, but I didn't pick it up again. I sat alone and said, this is harder than begging. My heart argued, reminding me of promises and laughter. I answered it silently, saying, I remember how that ended. When we met again, he said, you're quiet. I replied, I'm thinking. He asked, about us? I said, about myself. He frowned and said, you sound selfish. I smiled and replied, I'm learning. He laughed uneasily. You won't last, he said. I thought of dying in the rain and answered, I already didn't. As he walked away, I felt the ache rise, then settle. I whispered, this is my first win. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I simply stepped back, held my silence, and watched love loosen its grip on me. For the first time, I chose myself and the world didn't end. I sat across from Maya and said, I enrolled in night classes. She blinked and asked, since when do you plan things without telling me? I smiled and replied, since I realized my life is mine. She leaned forward and said, you're scaring me. I laughed softly. Good. I said, that means I'm changing. She studied my face and asked, did Ethan hurt you again? I shook my head. No, I answered. I just stopped hurting myself. At the gym, the trainer asked, first time here? I nodded and said, I'm starting over. He smiled and replied, that's a good reason. My body ached, but I welcomed it. I whispered to myself, pain that heals is different. Later, when I canceled plans, people sounded annoyed. I said, I'm unavailable, and hung up without apologizing. The silence afterward felt powerful. Ethan started appearing everywhere. He asked, why are you always busy now? I replied, because I have things to do. He frowned and said, you never had time for yourself before. I answered, I never made it. He watched me closely, like he was searching for the girl who waited. I didn't give her back. One afternoon, Clara approached me with a bright smile. You look well, she said. I replied, thank you. She tilted her head and asked, are you okay with everything? I met her eyes and said, I am. She hesitated and laughed. You're very calm, she said. I shrugged. I like it this way. Her smile tightened. Ethan worries about you, she added. I replied, he doesn't need to. Maya later said, Clara asked me if you hate her. I raised an eyebrow and asked, what did you say? She grinned. I said you don't care enough to hate. I laughed and replied, that's accurate. Maya studied me and said, you're different. I nodded. I stopped performing. She asked, for him? I shook my head. For everyone. At class, a professor asked, any questions? I raised my hand and spoke clearly. My voice didn't shake. A girl whispered, you're confident. I smiled and said, I'm learning. When Ethan called that night, I didn't answer. He texted, are you avoiding me? I replied, I'm living. He didn't respond. Days passed like that. People tested my boundaries. Can you help me? They asked. I answered, not today. Some smiled. Some frowned. I watched carefully, and thought, so this is who stays when I stop bending. Ethan stared when he saw me laughing with Maya. He asked, "You seem happy." I replied, "I am calm." He said, "That's not the same." I answered, "It's better." Clara cornered me near the elevator and said, "You're not trying to take him back, right?" I laughed quietly. "You think too highly of yourself," I replied. Her face stiffened. "I just want clarity," she said. I nodded. "Then keep him," I answered. The doors opened and I walked away. That night, Maya said, "They're fighting." I shrugged and replied, "That's not my story." I looked at my notes, my schedule, my reflection, and whispered, I was invisible because I allowed it. I wasn't loud about my change. I didn't explain myself. I simply grew into the woman he never noticed, and somehow, that made him unable to look away. Ethan asked me to meet him and said, "I need to talk." I nodded and replied, "Okay." When I arrived, Clara was already there. I looked at them and thought, so this is how it happens again. Ethan cleared his throat and said, "I've made a decision." I crossed my arms and answered, "You always do." Clara glanced at me, waiting. Ethan said, "I'm choosing her." He paused, like he expected something dramatic. I simply said, "All right." The silence stretched. Ethan frowned and asked, "That's it?" I tilted my head and replied, "What else should there be?" Clara shifted uncomfortably. She said, "Iris, I didn't mean to hurt you." I looked at her and answered, "You didn't." Ethan laughed nervously. "You're pretending," he said. I shrugged. "I don't need to pretend," I replied. In my past life, this moment broke me. I remembered crying and saying, "Please don't." I remembered bargaining and asking, "What about us?" Now I felt light. Ethan watched my face closely and asked, "Aren't you angry?" I said, "No." He pressed, "Sad?" I shook my head. "No." His voice sharpened. "You loved me." I met his eyes and replied, "I did." Clara reached for his arm and said, "Maybe she's in shock." I smiled slightly and answered, "I'm very clear." Ethan pulled his arm back and said, "You're supposed to care." I laughed softly. "I already did," I said. "I'm done." He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. "You're acting cold," he accused. I replied, "I'm being honest." He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You're just trying to look strong," he said. I answered, "No, I finally am." Clara whispered, "Ethan," warning him, but he ignored her. "Say something," he demanded. I nodded and said, "I hope you're happy." That was all. Clara blinked. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He said, "You're not even fighting." I replied, "Why would I?" He looked offended. "Because we mattered," he said. I tilted my head and answered, "We mattered when I mattered." His face hardened. "So you're blaming me?" he said. I shook my head. "I'm releasing myself," I replied. Clara spoke again. "We didn't plan this." I answered calmly, "You don't need my permission." She looked relieved and uneasy at the same time. Ethan rubbed his temples and said, "You're making this weird." I smiled faintly. "You made it clear," I said. "I'm just respecting your choice." He watched me stand up and asked, "Where are you going?" I replied, "Home." He scoffed. "Just like that?" I nodded. "Just like that." My heart beat steadily. No shaking. No begging. I picked up my bag and said, "Take care." Clara whispered, "Good luck," unsure if she meant it. I nodded once. As I walked away, Ethan called my name. "Iris." I turned and asked, "Yes?" He hesitated and said, "You'll regret this." I smiled and replied, "I already lived that regret." His face went pale. I turned back and kept walking. Outside, the air felt light. I whispered, "I survived this once." My phone stayed silent. No tears fell. No ache rose. I realized something important as I crossed the street. History only repeats when you let it. This time, I chose not to interfere, not to suffer, not to stay. His choice freed me, and my indifference was the part he couldn't accept at all. I was walking out of the building when Maya said, "Don't turn around." I asked calmly, "Why?" She lowered her voice and said, "He's here." I nodded and replied, "Okay." My heart stayed quiet. No rush. No ache. We kept walking. Then I heard Ethan's voice behind me say, "Iris." I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes forward and said to Maya, "Let's go." She whispered, "Are you sure?" I answered, "Yes." My steps stayed steady. Ethan called again, louder. "Iris, wait." People turned. I didn't. Maya squeezed my arm and said, "He looks shocked." I replied, "That's not my concern." We passed him like strangers passing on a street. No glance. No pause. Just silence. Outside, Maya stopped and stared at me. "You really didn't look," she said. I nodded. "There was nothing to see," I replied. She laughed nervously. "He froze," she said. "Like you disappeared." I adjusted my bag and said, "I did." My chest felt light, almost empty, and I welcomed it. Later that day, my phone buzzed. Maya texted, "He asked me about you." I typed back, "What did he say?" She replied, "He asked if you were okay." I stared at the message and whispered, "Interesting." I texted, "What did you answer?" She sent, "I said you're doing great." I smiled and put the phone down. That evening, Clara called me. I answered and said, "Hello." Her voice sounded tight. "Iris," she said, "did you see Ethan today?" I replied, "I passed him." She hesitated. "You didn't talk to him?" she asked. I said, "No." There was a pause. She asked, "Why?" I answered, "Because I didn't need to." Her breathing changed. "He was upset," she said. I replied, "That happens." She tried to laugh. "You're doing this on purpose," she said. I answered calmly, "I'm doing nothing." She said, "You're making him uncomfortable." I replied, "I'm not responsible for his feelings." She went quiet, then said, "He keeps asking about you." I answered, "You should talk to him." She snapped, "I am." I said, "Good luck," and ended the call. Maya later said, "Clara is nervous." I asked, "About what?" She replied, "About losing control." I shrugged and said, "Control isn't love." Maya watched me and said, "You sound so sure." I answered, "I learned what silence does." The next day, I saw Ethan again across the street. He stared openly this time. I didn't react. My phone rang. It was him. I declined the call. A message followed. "Why are you acting like I don't exist?" I read it and whispered, "Because you don't." I didn't reply. That night, Maya said, "You know he's not used to this." I smiled faintly and said, "Neither was I." She nodded slowly. "You were always there," she said. I answered, "That was the mistake." I sat on my bed and thought about how loud I used to be, how hard I tried to be seen. Now I was quiet, and suddenly everyone noticed. A mutual friend later said, "Ethan keeps asking what you're doing." I replied, "Living." They laughed awkwardly. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. My absence spoke clearly. When I closed my eyes that night, I realized something important. Walking past him, without a glance, wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was proof. Proof that he no longer held space in my mind. I whispered, "This is the turning point." For the first time, my silence was louder than my love ever was, and he was the one left listening to it. Maya slid into the seat across from me and said, "Have you heard?" I looked up and asked, "About what?" She lowered her voice and replied, "Ethan missed another deadline." I nodded and said, "That happens." She stared at me. "You're not curious?" I smiled and answered, "Not really." She leaned back and said, "You're scary calm." I replied, "I worked hard for this." Later that day, Ethan called. I didn't answer. A message followed. Can we talk? I read it and whispered. About what? I deleted it. I went to class instead. The professor said, "Good work on your project." I smiled and replied, "Thank you." My phone stayed silent and I felt proud of that. That evening, Clara appeared beside me outside the building. She said, "You seem busy." I answered, "I am." She crossed her arms and asked, "Did Ethan tell you anything?" I shook my head. "We don't talk," I replied. She frowned. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said. I looked at her and answered, "So am I." She hesitated. "You don't care anymore," she accused. I smiled faintly. "I care about the right things." Maya later said, "People at his office are talking." I asked, "Talking about what?" She replied, "About mistakes he made." I nodded slowly. "Everyone makes choices," I said. Maya studied me and asked, "Did you know about any of it?" I shook my head. "And even if I did, it wouldn't be my problem," I answered. She laughed softly. "You really changed," she said. I replied, "I stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine." A man approached me after class and said, "You're Iris, right?" I nodded. "Yes." He smiled politely and said, "I'm Noah. I'm a journalist." My heart stayed steady. "Nice to meet you," I replied. He asked, "Did you used to work with Ethan?" I answered, "No," he tilted his head. "But you knew him well," he said. I replied, "Past tense." He nodded. "I'm looking into some things," he said carefully. I met his eyes and answered, "Then I hope you find the truth." He hesitated and asked, "You don't want to comment?" I smiled and replied, "I don't need to." He thanked me and walked away. Maya whispered, "That was intense." I shrugged. "It's not my story," I said again. The next morning, Ethan cornered me near the entrance and said, "People are spreading rumors." I looked at him and asked, "About what?" He said, "About my work." I nodded. "That sounds stressful," I replied. He snapped, "Do you know anything?" I shook my head. "No," he searched my face and said, "You're enjoying this." I answered calmly, "I'm enjoying my peace." He laughed bitterly. "You think you're better than me now," he said. I replied, "I think I'm better to myself." He opened his mouth, then closed it. I walked past him without another word. That night, Clara called again.
"He's changing," she said.
I asked, "Aren't we all?" She sounded unsure. "I don't know him like I thought," she admitted. I replied, "That realization hurts." She whispered, "What did you do?" I answered, "I stepped back." I sat alone later and said to myself, "This is karma." Not loud, not cruel, just steady. I studied, I exercised, I laughed with Maya. I slept well. I didn't scheme or wait. I simply lived. When Maya said, "His world is shaking," I replied, "Mine isn't." And I understood something important. Karma doesn't need my help. Detachment was my strongest weapon, and it was already doing the work for me. Quietly, one consequence at a time. Lucas sat across from me and said, "You don't have to explain yourself." I looked up surprised and asked, "Why not?" He smiled slightly and replied, "Because silence is also an answer." I laughed softly. "Most people hate silence," I said. He nodded. "They usually want something from it." His words settled calmly in my chest. We met during a group discussion. When it ended, he asked, "Coffee?" I answered, "I only have 20 minutes." He said, "Then we'll take 10. No pressure. No disappointment. Just acceptance." As we walked, he asked, "Do you enjoy what you're studying?" I replied, "For the first time, yes." He smiled. "That matters," he said. I noticed how he listened. When I paused, he waited. When I changed the subject, he followed. I said, "You're very patient." He replied, "I respect pace." That word stayed with me. Pace. He didn't lean closer when I spoke softly. He didn't interrupt my quiet. I realized how rare that was. Maya later whispered, "Who is he?" I smiled and said, "Someone calm."
She grinned.
You like calm now? I nodded. I need it. Lucas waved goodbye and said, see you around. No promises. No expectations. Just space. A few days later, Ethan saw us talking. He approached and said, who's that? I answered, a friend. Lucas looked at Ethan and nodded politely. Nice to meet you, he said. Ethan stared and replied, do I know you? Lucas smiled. I don't think so. The air felt tight. I said, I have to go. Lucas said, I'll walk with you. Ethan's jaw tightened. As we walked away, Ethan called, Iris. I didn't answer. Lucas glanced at me and asked, do you want me to stop? I shook my head. No, I replied. He nodded and said nothing more. That meant more than reassurance ever did. Later, Lucas asked, was that difficult? I answered, it used to be. He said, and now? I thought for a moment and replied, now it's just noise. He smiled. You sound sure. I said, I'm learning. He laughed softly. So am I. Ethan texted me that night. Who is he? I read it and didn't respond. Another message followed. You're moving on too fast. I whispered. I stood still for years. I turned my phone face down. The next time Lucas and I met, he said, you seem lighter. I replied, I dropped something heavy. He didn't ask what. He just said, good. We sat quietly for a while. I broke the silence and said, you don't try to fix me. He answered, I don't think you're broken. Those words stayed with me all day. When Ethan confronted me later and said, you're replacing me, I replied, I'm not replacing anyone.
He scoffed.
Then what is he? I said calmly, he's someone who doesn't demand proof of my worth. Ethan laughed bitterly. You'll regret this, he said. I answered, I regret staying where I wasn't seen. Lucas noticed Ethan watching us from a distance. He asked, is that uncomfortable? I shook my head. Not anymore. He smiled and said, then let's keep walking.
We did.
That night, Maya said, Ethan looks threatened. I replied, that's not love. She nodded. Lucas treats you differently. I smiled and said, he treats me normally. As I lay in bed, I realized something important. Lucas didn't save me. He didn't pull me forward. He simply reflected the version of myself I was becoming. Healthy connection didn't feel intense or desperate. It felt quiet. It felt safe. And for the first time, I understood the difference between being wanted and being respected. Ethan waited for me outside and said, we need to talk. I stopped and asked, about what? He looked tired, restless. Nothing like the man who once looked above me.
About us, he said.
I replied, there is no us. He flinched and said, you didn't used to talk like that. I nodded. I didn't used to know better. He stepped closer and asked, why did you change? I shrugged and replied, I didn't. I just stopped pretending. He ran a hand through his hair and said, you were always emotional. I answered, I was always honest.
He scoffed.
You're punishing me, he said. I looked at him calmly and replied, I'm not doing anything to you. He laughed bitterly. You're cruel now, he accused. I shook my head. Cruelty needs intention, I said. I have none. That seemed to anger him more. You walked away like I meant nothing, he said. I replied, you taught me how.
His mouth opened, then closed.
He lowered his voice. I made a mistake, he said. I didn't answer. He waited, then said, aren't you going to say something? I met his eyes and replied, you already did. His shoulders dropped. I miss you, he admitted. I nodded. I know. He stared. That's all. I answered, that's all. He stepped back and said, you used to fight for me. I replied, I used to forget myself. He whispered, I didn't know you would leave. I said quietly, I didn't know I was allowed to. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, then sighed. I think about you all the time, he said. I answered, I don't. That silence hurt him more than shouting ever could. he asked. Is it because of Lucas? I shook my head. No, I replied. It's because of me. He frowned. You're choosing someone else, he said. I answered. I'm choosing peace. He laughed without humor. You sound so sure, he said. I replied. I had to be. He looked down and said, I ruined everything. I nodded once. Yes. He looked up quickly. You agree? I said, acknowledging isn't attacking. He swallowed. Can't you forgive me? He asked. I replied, forgiveness doesn't mean return. He closed his eyes and said, I don't recognize you. I answered, that's because you never looked. His voice broke. I loved you, he said. I replied, you loved how I stayed. He whispered, I'm sorry. I nodded again. I believe you. His eyes lit up for a second. Then why won't you try? He asked. I answered, because trying killed me once. He took a shaky breath. I would do things differently now, he said. I replied, you needed to then. He clenched his fists. You're so calm, he said. I answered, I finished my grief early. He shook his head. I deserve this, he muttered. I said, this isn't punishment. He looked confused. Then what is it? He asked. I replied, clarity. I stepped back and said, I hope you heal. He looked at me, eyes red, and said, I lost you. I nodded. Yes. As I walked away, I didn't feel powerful. I felt finished. Revenge would have kept us tied together. Silence freed me. His regret came late, but my understanding arrived right on time. I didn't need to hurt him. I only needed to stop explaining myself, and that was enough that I heard about them before I saw them. Maya whispered, Ethan's arguing with Clara again. I nodded and said, figures. She frowned. Do you want to see? I shook my head. Not really. I've seen enough to know. Later, a friend called and said, you won't believe what happened at the party. I asked calmly, what happened? She hesitated. Clara found out about some of Ethan's past decisions, financial stuff, lies. I replied, interesting. My tone was flat, detached. Maya sent me a message. Clara looks furious, he's panicking. I typed back. And she laughed nervously. I can't believe you don't care. I replied, I already lived that chaos once. I walked past the cafe where Ethan and Clara were meeting. They didn't see me, and I didn't look at them. I overheard, though. Ethan said, I can explain everything. Clara's voice was sharp. Explain? You lied about everything. You always do. I whispered under my breath. Not surprising. Ethan shouted, I didn't mean to, Clara interrupted. You never do. And I trusted you. His shoulders slumped. I could hear the pride breaking apart in his voice. I said quietly, finally. A waiter passed by and Ethan muttered, this is not what I wanted. Clara replied, not what you wanted? You wanted her. Now I don't even know you. I smiled faintly. You're finally invisible to her, too, I whispered. Maya texted me later. They're done. Clara walked out. I replied, not my problem. She added, Ethan looks broken. I typed back, good. Let him feel it. At home, I sat with my coffee and thought, this is what happens when pride isn't tempered by honesty. My phone buzzed. Ethan tried calling. I didn't answer. Another message. I never wanted this to happen. I read it and whispered, too late. I deleted it. Maya came over and said, it's worse than I thought. He's isolated. I replied, I can see that. She asked, do you feel bad? I shook my head. Not for him. Only for anyone who trusted him. Later, Clara called Maya. I listened from the other room. I can't believe I wasted time, Clara said. He's not the man I thought. Maya nodded. I whispered, neither was he ever for me. The news spread. Friends commented. Some laughed quietly. I stayed silent. Ethan's empire of pride was cracking, and no one had to push it. I didn't interfere. I didn't watch with glee. I simply observed. At night, I whispered to myself, This is the cost of choices made without care. I remembered my past self, how I used to beg, explain, and repair. I didn't move. I didn't intervene. I let the consequences unfold naturally. Maya said softly, "He looks defeated." I replied, "Exactly." She looked at me curiously. "You're calm, almost too calm." I shrugged. "I've been here before. Now I just watch from the other side." Before I went to bed, I thought about karma quietly working, no need for my hand. I whispered, "Some lessons are best learned alone." My chest was light, detached. Observing from afar was enough. Ethan's collapse wasn't my victory, but it was proof that balance always finds a way, and I didn't have to force it. I sat across from Maya and said, "I thought about it all day." She asked, "About what?" I replied calmly, exposing him, telling everyone everything. She leaned forward, and I shook my head. "I won't." She blinked. "Why not?" I smiled faintly. "Because winning isn't always proving a point." Later, Noah, the journalist, approached me. "Iris," he said, "I'm finding more details about Ethan." I nodded and replied, "I figured." He asked, "Do you want to say something?" I shook my head. "No comment," I said. He smiled. "That's fair." I added quietly, "Sometimes silence tells more than words." Maya whispered, "You're really walking away?" I looked at her and said, "I'm walking forward." She frowned. "But he deserves," I interrupted gently. "No one deserves my energy." That evening, I passed by Ethan's office. A few people whispered, and I saw him stressed, flustered, but I didn't stop. Clara appeared briefly, looking tense. I nodded to her quietly, and she nodded back. No words, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement of reality. At home, I thought about revenge, exposure, proving I was right. I whispered, "It used to feel necessary." I smiled faintly. Now it just feels empty. I poured coffee and said aloud to myself, "Peace is quieter, but it's stronger." Maya called. "People are asking if you'll ever talk about him," she said. I replied, "Let them wonder." She laughed softly. "That's a new Iris." I shrugged. It's the only Iris who matters now. The next day, Lucas joined me for a walk. He asked, "Do you ever think about confrontation?" I shook my head. "Not anymore," I said. He smiled. "You really changed." I nodded. I stopped needing to prove my worth. Later, a mutual friend asked, "Why aren't you angry?" I answered, "Because anger ties you to what you don't control." They looked puzzled. "So, you're just letting it happen?" I said, "Exactly. Let life handle it." Ethan tried texting me again. "I need to explain." I read it, then whispered, "Explain to whom?" I deleted it. I felt no tug, no ache, only calm. Maya said, "You're really different now." I smiled. I learned that surviving is winning. I thought back to my first life, the tears, the begging, the fear of being unseen. I whispered, I used to chase him like I was nothing. Now I walked with my head high, knowing my value wasn't tied to him. Lucas asked, "Are you ever tempted to interfere?" I shook my head. I tried controlling life once. It hurt. Now I observe, quietly, and keep my own peace. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the city glow. Maya whispered, "You're finally free." I replied softly, "I am free." I thought about Ethan, about Clara, about every expectation, every regret. I said aloud, "Let life unfold. I'll live well regardless." Before sleep, I journaled. Revenge isn't mine. Exposure isn't mine. Survival is mine. Peace is mine. I closed the notebook and whispered, "This is victory," quietly claimed. I realized I didn't need anyone to recognize my strength. I didn't need applause, justice, or revenge. I had my life, my boundaries, my calm. And for the first time, that was more than enough. I was walking through the park when Maya whispered, "He's here." I glanced casually. Ethan stood near the fountain, hands trembling slightly. I didn't stop. I didn't turn. I see him, I said softly. Maya asked, do you want to confront him? I shook my head. No, I replied. That's not my story anymore. A friend nearby said, he looks broken. I nodded. I guess some lessons come late. Maya frowned. You're too calm. I shrugged. I already lived through this once. From a distance, I overheard Ethan muttering, I can't believe I let her go. I lost her forever. Clara was nowhere in sight. He sank onto a bench, burying his face in his hands. I whispered under my breath. Finally, clarity. Maya said, are you satisfied? I shook my head. Satisfaction isn't the point. She asked, then what is it? I replied calmly, closure. I walked past him without changing pace. Ethan's head lifted slightly, eyes wide. Iris, he called. I didn't respond. A small crowd had gathered, noticing his distress. Someone murmured, he's really losing it. I kept walking. No glance. No acknowledgement. Silence became my strongest statement. Maya said quietly, he's panicking. I smiled faintly. That's his burden, not mine. Later, a mutual friend texted me. He asked everyone about you. He's desperate. I typed back. Let him search. I don't live in the past. At home, I poured tea and whispered, I survived the version of myself that begged, that waited, that hurt. Maya said, you sound lighter. I nodded, because I am emotionally free. Ethan's messages kept coming, each more desperate than the last. I need to see you. Please, Iris. Don't ignore me. I read them all, then deleted them. I whispered, I don't need closure from him. I already have my peace. The next morning, Lucas joined me for a walk. He asked, did you see him yesterday? I replied calmly, yes. I walked past him. He smiled. And you didn't react? I shook my head. No. Reacting keeps you tied. I'm untied now. Maya texted later. People are talking. He's losing it publicly. I typed back. Let life unfold. I'm moving forward. At the cafe, someone mentioned Ethan's breakdown. I sipped my coffee and said softly, that's his consequence, not mine. Maya nodded, smiling. You're unshakable. I replied, I stopped living for his recognition. Lucas asked, do you ever miss him? I shook my head. I used to. Now I only remember the lessons. He smiled. You've grown. I nodded. I chose myself this time. I walked home that evening, city lights reflecting in puddles. Maya whispered, do you feel free? I answered, completely. I thought about every tear I shed, every time I lowered myself for him. I whispered, I no longer look back. Outside, Ethan's voice carried faintly behind me. Iris. I didn't respond. I didn't slow down. My chest felt light. My step steady. I realized indifference wasn't cruelty. It was the strongest justice. At my apartment, I closed the door and leaned against it. Maya said softly, you're finally untouchable. I smiled faintly and whispered, untouchable and unafraid. Before sleep, I journaled. I survived love that destroyed me. I survived silence that haunted me. Now I walk forward. I no longer look back. I placed the pen down, feeling a calm so deep it was almost loud. No triumph, no gloating, just quiet strength. For the first time, I knew that moving forward untouched by the past was the most powerful justice I could claim.